I never imagined the deepest wound of my life would come from the people I once trusted most. The night I pretended to leave town, I watched my own world crack open from a distance I did not know I would need. What I saw inside that house, the one place meant to protect me, changed everything I believed about love, loyalty, and the safety of growing old. Sometimes the truth does not knock. It breaks the door down. And mine arrived in the form of a betrayal so sharp, it carved a permanent line between the life I had and the life I would have to build. Before we step into today's story, drop a quick comment and let us know where you're joining us from. We're always amazed by how these stories connect people across different cultures and places. Your voice in the comments keeps this community alive, so don't hold back. And if you're new here, hit subscribe and turn on notifications so you'll always be the first to catch our latest tales. Now, sit back, relax, and get ready for a journey that might just change the way you see things. Let's dive in. My name is Evelyn Harper, and at 63 years old, I have learned that silence can tell you far more about a house than any sound ever could. My little cedar-shingled home in Cape Cod sits on a gentle rise above the harbor, where gulls circle like restless thoughts and the scent of salt clings to every window frame. Most mornings, I rise before the sun, padding barefoot across the old wooden floorboards that creak in familiar protest, as if greeting me the way an old friend would. I brew coffee in the porcelain cup my mother once used, and I reread the letters my husband Robert wrote to me when we first married. Long before loss settled into the corners of my life like dust I cannot sweep away. Cape Cod has always been a place where time feels slower, where people greet one another by name, and where age is treated with something close to reverence. Our town is small enough that folks remember where you bought your first bicycle and who danced with who at the summer festival 30 years ago. When I walk through the streets, the clapboard houses lean slightly in the ocean wind, and the fishermen at the docks still lift their hands in tired but genuine salute. Peace in this town. This town is an old coat everyone wears. My days follow a comforting rhythm. I help manage the scholarship fund for the public library, attend meetings with the local historical society, and tend to my flower beds with the same patience I once used to raise my children. Inside my home are layers of memories: my grandmother's silverware, my mother's painted china, the velvet jewelry box holding family heirlooms, and albums heavy with photographs from my life with Robert. These things root me in a way that nothing else does. Dorothy Lane, my neighbor across the street, is one of the few people who truly understands the quiet ache of widowhood. She is sharp-eyed, quick-tongued, and endlessly observant. Her garden is a maze of roses, trimmed with the precision that mirrors her ability to notice every unusual movement on the block. She often reminds me that women our age must rely on intuition, because it rarely lies. For a long time, I believed my intuition had grown dull with grief, but after Robert passed, my children began appearing far more often than they used to. Mark, once distant and career-driven, arrived with organic groceries and forced smiles. Lila, polished and careful with her words, stayed overnight more frequently, insisting that she worried about me living alone. Their sudden attention felt less like affection and more like an evaluation, as if the two of them were appraising my life the way one might assess the condition of antique furniture. Little things began to unsettle me. A drawer left slightly open when I was certain I had closed it. A document in my desk resting at a different angle. Jewelry that seemed a shade out of alignment. Perhaps these were tricks of memory, but the unease stayed with me. My background as a former legal secretary gave me a particular sensitivity to order, to details, to the quiet ways people reveal their intentions. Some evenings, I would sit in the dim light of the living room, listening to the house breathe around me, and I would wonder whether the shift I sensed came from within me or within the walls themselves. The truth pressed gently but persistently at the back of my mind, like a tide rising before a storm. Something was changing. Something was out of place. And as I looked across the room at a picture of Robert smiling in the summer sun, I could not shake the feeling that my peaceful life, so carefully preserved, was beginning to tilt ever so slightly. If you're still watching, and this story has you hooked already, comment number 1 below so I know you're with me. Now let's move on to chapter 2. I first realized something was shifting in my home life on an ordinary Tuesday morning, while the gulls screeched outside and the air smelled faintly of low tide. I had been standing in my kitchen, staring at the same coffee mug my mother once used, when the idea struck me with a clarity that almost startled me. I would tell my children I was leaving town for a week. I would pretend to travel to Cape May, New Jersey, to visit an old friend whose name I chose at random. It was a small untruth, but it felt necessary, like a door I had to open if I wanted to understand what lingered in the shadows of my own house. When I told Mark and Lila about the trip, their reactions came so quickly and with such intensity that I felt the first real chill of suspicion. Mark insisted on driving me to the airport even though I told him I planned to take the bus. Lila asked about hotel names, street addresses, and the exact dates I would be away, as though preparing a detailed itinerary for someone who was not traveling at all. Their questions overlapped, and their expressions carried something I could not name, something almost eager. I tried to smile through it, but the unease settled into me like damp air. Over the next few days, their visits increased. They arrived with bags of organic groceries I never asked for, vitamins I did not need, and unsolicited opinions about home safety. They walked through the rooms with lingering glances, pausing at corners, shelves, and drawers. They asked about insurance documents, property deeds, and whether I had ever considered simplifying complicated responsibilities at my age. Their tone always carried a polite veneer, but underneath it was a kind of calculation I had never seen in my children before. More unsettling were the small disruptions that began emerging in my daily life. The coffee tasted slightly metallic, enough to make me frown after the first sip. By afternoon, a headache stretched behind my eyes in a dull, pulsing way. A locked jewelry drawer felt looser than usual. A letter from Robert, which I had left on my desk the night before, was gone by morning and then mysteriously reappeared in a different stack. Each of these things could be brushed aside, but together they formed a pattern I could not ignore. One evening, I walked across the street to visit Dorothy. I told her, cautiously, that something felt wrong in my home. She listened without interrupting, her eyes narrowing with the precision of someone who has lived long enough to understand the world's sharper edges. She said quietly that sometimes children behave differently when they believe an inheritance is close. She told me that if my instincts were speaking, I should not silence them. Her words, simple and steady, made my pulse thrum with a mix of dread and clarity. After that night, I began documenting everything. I wrote down times, dates, and observations. I photographed the placement of valuables. I watched how Mark's eyes sharpened when I mentioned bank accounts, and how Lila's smile tightened when I said I planned to keep my home exactly as it was. Their faces shifted subtly when they thought I was not looking, revealing glimmers of impatience, urgency, and something more troubling. It was becoming painfully clear that my children no longer saw me as a capable woman, but as a fragile figure whose decisions could be manipulated. The realization stung more deeply than I expected. Love, it seemed, could be overshadowed by opportunity. One quiet night, I sat in the dim glow of a single lamp, listening to the house settle around me. The rooms felt different, as though holding secrets in their corners. I understood then that the only way to uncover the truth was to step away and watch what happened when. They thought I was gone. If something dangerous lived inside my own home, I needed to leave it empty long enough to finally see it. If you're still watching, and the tension is starting to pull you in, comment number 2 below to let me know you're following every twist. Now let's move on to Chapter 3. I left my home on a gray wind-brushed afternoon, the kind where the horizon blurred into a faint mist above the water. My suitcase held almost nothing, just enough to make the lie believable in case Mark or Lila dropped by unannounced. I drove to Harborview Inn, a modest 2-story building perched near a quiet marina 2 hours away. The room smelled faintly of lemon cleaner, and the bedspread was patterned with tiny blue anchors, an attempt at nautical optimism. I sat on the edge of the mattress, pulling together every element of my fabricated trip. A fake email confirmation, a handful of staged photographs from past travels, and a message to my children about arriving safely. The deception tasted bitter, but the unease in my chest made it feel unavoidable. That evening, after the sun slid behind the horizon, I drove back toward my neighborhood. The sky had darkened to a muted indigo, and a cold wind swept in from the coast, rattling the street signs as I parked beneath a maple tree across from my own house. From that distance, my home looked peaceful, almost serene. But serenity can be a mask, and I was there to peel it back. My hands tightened on the steering wheel as the minutes crept by, each second pressing heavier against my ribs. Then came the soft tapping on my window. I nearly jumped, my pulse kicking hard. Dorothy leaned in close, her breath fogging the glass. She opened the door with a familiarity earned over decades and settled into the passenger seat without hesitation. Her sharp eyes scanned the house while she updated me on what she had seen over the last 2 nights. She said they came like clockwork, moving with a strange blend of confidence and secrecy. She said they behaved like people who had rehearsed their steps. Her final warning floated between us, quiet but firm, saying I needed to stay awake for what was coming. As the clock blinked toward midnight, the tension thickened. The house remained dark, except for the faint reflections of street lamps glinting against the windows. Dorothy whispered that Mark usually arrived first, and right on cue, a figure slipped through the side walkway. A moment later, Lila's car eased to a stop half a block away. My breath caught as they entered the house with practiced ease, as though it belonged to them and not to me. At exactly midnight, the entire house lit up in one abrupt sweep. Every lamp, every overhead fixture, every hallway bulb. The effect was jarring, like a stage suddenly illuminated, exposing actors who believed no one was watching. Mark moved through the living room wearing a headlamp, inspecting furniture, handling framed photographs, and studying the details of each piece. Lila appeared upstairs, opening drawers with the gloved hands, lifting jewelry boxes, and examining their contents with deliberate care. They did not rush. They did not hesitate. They acted like 2 people conducting a detailed inventory. When Mark carried in the first cardboard box from the garage, my chest tightened painfully. I watched him pack away the family silver. Lila followed by placing my great-grandmother's sapphire necklace into another box, the gesture almost casual. Their mouths moved silently in quick exchanges, their cooperation unsettling in its ease. I raised my phone with trembling fingers, recording each movement. Betrayal has a weight that settles in the bones, but beneath the shock, a colder clarity formed. I understood that what I was witnessing was not an impulsive act. It was a plan crafted by the very people I had brought into this world. Dorothy whispered that this was the first night they had brought boxes, that this night mattered. I nodded, unable to speak. I continued filming as my children dismantled my life piece by piece. Unaware that the woman they believed safely out of town was watching from the shadows. And in that silence, something inside me hardened, not anger alone, but resolve. I would let this play out. I needed to know exactly how far they were willing to go. If you're still watching and you can feel something bigger brewing beneath the surface, comment number 3 below so I know you're still here. Now, let's step into chapter 4. Morning light pushed through the thin curtains of my room at Harborview Inn, soft and pale like a hesitant apology. I woke with the sense that something inside me had been scraped raw. Sleep had come in fragments, each one haunted by the image of Mark and Lila moving through my home as though it were a showroom they were preparing to empty. For a long moment I lay still, staring at the ceiling patterned with shadows from the swaying marina trees, trying to steady the tremor in my chest. When I finally sat up, the ache in my ribs reminded me that heartbreak does not always arrive through loss. Sometimes it comes through revelation. I opened my phone and replayed the video from the night before, each frame cut into me with surgical precision. Mark lifting the silverware set, Lila slipping my great-grandmother's sapphire necklace into a box with careful efficiency. Their faces showed no guilt, only determination. Watching them felt like witnessing strangers wearing the faces of my children. I fought the rising wave of emotion, forcing myself to breathe slowly until the heat behind my eyes settled. Grief has a way of turning into clarity when pain becomes too sharp to ignore. When the sun was fully up, I made my first calculated move. I called Mark with a tone of confused hesitation, letting my voice wobble just enough to seem fragile. I asked whether he remembered seeing a particular necklace before I left, because I could have sworn I put it on my dresser. There was a brief pause on his end, just a flicker of silence, but it confirmed more than any confession. Then he shifted into that smooth, patronizing sweetness I had begun to recognize. He spoke about how stress can affect memory, how people our age sometimes misplace things. His words wrapped themselves in concern, but underneath they felt like hooks made to pull me toward doubt. Not long after I hung up, Lila called. Her voice trembled with an artificial tenderness that used to fool me when she was a girl. She asked if I was eating well, if I felt disoriented at all during my trip. Then she slipped in her real purpose, suggesting that once I returned, she and Mark should help reorganize my belongings so the house would be safer and easier to manage. The phrasing was gentle, but the intent was sharp. I could hear the blueprint behind her sentences. Control the house, control the assets, control me. I kept my responses calm, careful, playing along while committing every word to memory. After the calls, I began documenting everything. I photographed each drawer, cabinet, and shelf from the inn's quiet desk, using the pictures I had taken previously as reference. I wrote down timestamps, cataloged items I had seen them move, and recorded notes on their behavior. I even recorded the phone calls, storing the files under dull, unmemorable names to avoid suspicion. My background as a legal secretary had taught me the value of documentation. Paper trails do not lie. When I checked my home's doorbell camera, something I had forgotten I left active, I discovered a new fracture in the truth. A sheet of paper lay on the dining table. Estate planning checklist. It listed evaluations, insurance inquiries, jewelry transfers, and most damning of all, a handwritten line from Mark stating that they needed to act quickly before I changed my mind. The sight of that note cracked something open inside me. Whatever hope I had that this was all some misunderstanding dissolved instantly. For a while, I simply sat on the edge of the bed, hands trembling, tears slipping unchecked down my cheeks. But the pain did not break me. It hardened, reshaped itself into resolve. If my children believed they could corner me with manipulation and deceit, they had underestimated the woman who had survived more storms than they knew. By evening, I was standing before the inn's small mirror, staring into my own eyes with a steadiness I thought I had lost. I whispered a quiet promise to myself. If they wanted a battle, then I would give them one, and I would not lose. If you're still watching, and the story is gripping you tighter than before. Comment number 4 below, so I know you haven't blinked yet. Now, let's move forward to chapter 5. The second night I returned to my neighborhood, the wind whipped hard enough to rattle the stop signs. Clouds rolled low across the sky, thick and heavy like the warning edge of a storm. I parked farther down the street than before, positioning my car behind a tall hedge where the shadows swallowed the headlights. My heartbeat was fast, but my mind carried a sharpened steadiness that had not been there the night prior. The ache of betrayal had cooled into something that felt like metal settling in my spine. I was ready to see the truth without flinching. Dorothy appeared beside the car with the quiet efficiency of someone who had been watching longer than she admitted. She slid into the passenger seat holding a pair of binoculars and a small flashlight with red lens cover. Her face was tight, her mouth drawn into a line that told me she had seen enough to be afraid for me. She said she had spotted movement as early as 10:45 that night, much earlier than the first incident. Mark and Lila were clearly accelerating whatever plan they believed they could carry out. From across the street, my house sat dark at 11:40. Its windows reflected only the glow of the street lamps. But then, through the small basement window near the side yard, a faint flicker appeared, a thin, shifting light. Dorothy tapped the glass lightly, pointing. I leaned forward and saw the outline of someone kneeling by the filing cabinets I kept downstairs. The familiar shape of a headlamp bobbed, illuminating the metal drawers and harsh white beams. That was where I stored my financial records, the files I guarded more carefully than my jewelry. At midnight, the lights behaved differently. Not the sudden blaze of every fixture turning on like the night before. Instead, only certain rooms illuminated. The study, the hallway, the basement stairwell. The pattern looked intentional, as if they had mapped out the house and were focusing on specific targets. My breath caught when I saw Lila in the study opening the concealed wall safe. Her gloved hands worked with calm, practiced precision. Papers spilled across the desk. Birth certificates, Robert's letters, old deeds, and insurance documents. Mark moved beside her, scanning documents with a portable device that glowed faint green each time a page passed through. They were not stealing. They were acquiring evidence, assembling ammunition. Then my eyes caught something new on the kitchen table. A yellow envelope lay open, its contents fanned across the surface. When Mark picked it up, the bold print on the front was unmistakable even from a distance. Draft petition for guardianship of Evelyn Harper. My stomach twisted. Guardianship, legal control, the power to decide where I lived, how I spent money, what decisions I could make. They had filled out nearly every section. Claims of severe cognitive decline, requests for authority over financial matters, even permissions to restrict my autonomy for her own safety. Only signatures were missing. My breath turned thin. This was not merely betrayal. It was a planned erasure of my independence. Then Mark slammed a drawer shut and cursed under his breath. Lila asked what he could not find. He replied that the medical assessment form was missing, the one required to submit a guardianship petition. Lila, without hesitation, said that it would not matter as long as they made me appear confused when I returned. The casual cruelty of that sentence struck me so hard I felt the world tilt. Then came the sentence that pushed the moment into full eruption. Lila said that if I refused to sign temporary transfer papers, they could worsen the situation until the court agreed I was unfit. Mark answered that confusion would work in their favor. I hit record on my phone, capturing every cold syllable. My hands shook, not from fear, but from the clarity of knowing exactly what they intended to do to me. For the first time, I felt the full weight of how dangerously far they were willing to go. Dorothy whispered something, but I barely heard. I watched my children pack away the documents of my life like they owned them. By the time Mark and Lila finished marking their checklist, I understood that this was no longer a matter of waiting. I tightened my hold on the phone and whispered, steady and certain, that tomorrow they would never touch anything of mine again. The drive back to Harbor View Inn felt longer than it had the night before, even though the road was the same narrow ribbon cutting between the dark pines. Wind pushed hard against the sides of my car, and the faint roar of the ocean followed me like an echo I could not escape. When I reached the inn, my hands were stiff around the steering wheel, so cold I barely felt my own skin. I let myself into the small room and closed the door carefully, as though the storm outside might slip in behind me. My pulse was still uneven, my breath thin. The shock of what I had witnessed had settled into something deeper and harder. I sat at the edge of the bed and opened my phone. The video from the second night played with stark clarity, every moment a fresh puncture to my heart. I watched Lila lifting documents from the hidden wall safe, her face calm, her movements precise. I watched Mark scanning papers without hesitation, as if he had every right to them. I replayed their words, each one rehearsed, each one sharpening the truth of their intentions. Listening again felt like standing barefoot on ice. Their voices held no regret, no hesitation, only the determination of two people who believed their plan was justified. I paused the recording and stared at the frozen frame of their silhouettes. Somewhere inside me, fear shifted, making room for resolve. At 2 a.m, I called Dorothy. She answered at once with the clipped tone of a woman who had not slept, but also had no intention of resting. I told her I was ready to act, and she said she would be at the courthouse the moment it opened. Her confidence steadied me for a heartbeat, but doubt crept back in as soon as we hung up. I knew that one wrong step could give Mark and Lila exactly what they needed. They had already tried to shape a narrative of confusion and decline. A single moment of emotional weakness could be used to twist the truth in their favor. My phone vibrated again. Mark's name lit the screen. The hour alone was enough to raise every nerve in my body. I hesitated, then forced myself to answer. His voice was warm, falsely casual, asking whether I was resting well and reminding me that we needed to talk seriously about the future. The words coiled tight in my gut. I kept my tone even, offering nothing that might signal fear or suspicion. When I ended the call, I sat still for a long moment, palms pressed to my thighs until the trembling stopped. I understood then that this was no longer about protecting my home. It was about protecting the core of who I was. If my children were preparing legal documents, I needed legal ground stronger than theirs. I would not let them twist my life into a story that suited their ambition. I reached for my coat, and something crinkled in the pocket. When I pulled it free, I felt my stomach drop. It was a folded sheet of paper with a crude layout of my house. Each room was marked with handwritten notes detailing where valuables were kept. At the bottom, in Mark's handwriting, was a chilling message. If she returns early, move to Plan B. I stared at the page until the ink seemed to pulse. They had mapped my life like a burglary target and prepared contingencies in case I trusted myself more than them. I stood at the window looking out at the faint glow of the sleeping town. The choice before me was sharp. Pretending confusion would give them power. Facing them with evidence would sever the remains of our bond. I thought of Robert, of the woman he had loved, of the dignity I had fought to keep. The answer rose inside me with quiet certainty. I gathered my documents, placed them neatly into a single folder, and whispered the promise that had formed in my chest. Tomorrow, no one would ever again decide my life for me. If you're still watching and the stakes feel higher than ever, comment number 6 below so I know you're ready for what comes next. Now, let's continue with Chapter 7. I woke before sunrise, the kind of waking that comes not from rest, but from the weight of everything waiting on the other side of the door. The Harbor View Inn was quiet. its hallway still cloaked in the softness of early morning, yet inside my chest everything felt loud and unsettled. Dorothy met me in the lobby with 2 cups of lukewarm coffee and the steady gaze of someone who had seen storms like this before. She squeezed my arm, and without needing to say anything, we walked out into the gray morning toward the Barnstable County Courthouse. The sky over Cape Cod hung low, heavy with mist, as if the world understood the gravity of the day ahead. When we stepped inside the courthouse, my hand shook despite the warmth of the building. I carried a folder so thick it no longer closed properly, a folder filled with the pieces of truth that had cost me sleep, safety, and the illusion that my children still saw me as their mother. We submitted everything. The clerk's expression shifted from politeness to alarm as she watched the videos, read the notes, and examined the photograph of the guardianship draft my children had hidden. Soon, 2 officers joined us, asking questions with professionalism, but also visible disbelief. I explained every detail: the whispers behind doors, the sudden kindness that felt sharpened instead of soft, the paperwork they prepared, the late-night search through my house carried out with the confidence of people who believed they were entitled to its contents. The officers assured me I had acted just in time and that they would process a temporary restriction order preventing my children from stepping foot near me or my home. Hearing that felt like air returning to my lungs for the first time in days. While I was still at the courthouse, my children tried to return to my home, perhaps hoping to salvage whatever they feared they were losing. Dorothy and I arrived just as the officers confronted them. Mark attempted to argue, and Lila had cried as though she were the one betrayed. Watching them stand on my lawn, confused and angry that their scheme had been exposed, twisted something deep inside me. They looked like strangers wearing the faces of my children. When the officers escorted them off my property, I felt a sharp pain and a hollow relief in equal measure. This was not the ending I ever imagined for us, but it was the one they brought upon themselves. Inside the house, the air felt wrong. Every room bore the fingerprints of their intrusion: drawers left open, folders out of place, boxes they had not finished filling. On the floor near the entryway, partially kicked beneath a shelf, I noticed a thick white envelope. Inside it were documents they had prepared: a temporary financial control form with my name already filled in, and a printed guide describing psychological techniques to pressure older adults into signing legal papers. Discovering this second layer of their plan shook me more deeply than I expected. It proved that what they attempted was not impulsive, but carefully constructed. That night, I sat in the dim light of my living room, surrounded by the quiet of a home that had almost been stolen from me. Despite the hurt, there was a stillness inside me, a clarity sharper than fear. I had survived the worst of their intentions, and I would never again allow anyone, not even my own children, to decide the course of my life. The morning after everything unraveled, I stepped onto my porch and looked out at the pale stretch of ocean dissolving into the horizon. Cape Cod was wrapped in a thin veil of mist, the kind that softened every outline and made the world feel suspended. My body felt heavy from a night without rest, yet my mind was sharper than it had been in weeks. Everything in my life had shifted. My relationship with my children was no longer a source of comfort, but a wound that had not stopped bleeding. I found myself wondering what life would look like without the illusion that family would always protect me. The question frightened me, but it also awakened a sense of independence that I had not felt since long before my husband passed. Dorothy drove me to meet an attorney, a woman named Helen Robertson, who seemed built from equal parts compassion and steel. She reviewed every piece of evidence already submitted to the authorities. With calm precision, she laid out the steps I needed to take to regain control over my life. I needed to seal my financial accounts with new safeguards, update my will so it could not be disputed, and file legal protection to prevent any future guardianship attempts from Mark or Lila. Each signature I placed on her documents felt like reclaiming a little piece of myself, a slow gathering of the strength my children had tried to strip away. Back at home, the practical work of rebuilding began. Locks were changed, security codes reset, and new cameras installed along the porch and garage. A police officer walked the perimeter of the property with me, explaining how patrol cars would check the street for the next several weeks. It was not the kind of reassurance I ever imagined needing, but it soothed something raw in my chest. Dorothy and a few kind neighbors helped me clean the house. Sorting through drawers and shelves turned into an excavation of what Mark and Lila had intended to take. A family album, a silver bracelet from my husband, a shoebox full of postcards from our early years together. Each rediscovered item felt like pulling a thread back through the fabric of my life, restoring something they had tried to unravel. In the garage, while dusting off forgotten boxes, I found a weathered wooden sign leaned against a wall. Mitchell Family Oyster Shack. My husband carved it decades ago, back when he dreamed of reopening the small seafood shack his parents once ran on the coast. I realized Mark and Lila had planned to sell the land the shack sat on, not because they cared about its history, but because it was suddenly valuable. Holding that sign in my hands, I felt a quiet surge of purpose. My life did not end at their betrayal. There were still dreams of my own that deserved air. That evening, as light poured through the windows and painted the living room gold, I sat with a notebook in my lap. I wrote down everything I wanted to protect, everything I still hoped to build, and everything I would never surrender again. For the first time since the nightmare began, I felt something steady returning. I felt myself returning. If you're still watching, and you can sense the final truths approaching, comment number 8 below to let me know you're staying with me till the end. Now, let's move into the conclusion. Chapter 9. Resolution. 3 months passed before I realized how much time had slipped through my fingers. Summer arrived in Cape Cod with its usual chorus of seabirds and the scent of warm sand, yet my world still felt as though it had been shaken loose from its foundation. The legal process was slow, methodical, and exhausting, but every step brought the truth closer to the surface. While tourists filled the streets outside, my days were spent gathering documents, attending meetings, and preparing for the final hearing that would determine the fate of the 2 people I once believed would guard my future. When the morning of the hearing arrived, I felt strangely calm. Dorothy sat beside me in the courthouse hallway, her quiet presence steadying my nerves. Helen, my attorney, reviewed her notes with the ease of a woman who had faced storms much larger than mine. When the doors opened, we entered the courtroom together. Mark and Lila were already seated. The sight of them struck me harder than I expected. Their faces looked hollow, drained of the confidence they once wore like armor. I searched their expressions for even a flicker of the children I raised, but all I saw were 2 adults who had gambled with their mother's life and lost. The prosecutor presented everything: the false guardianship papers, the attempt to pressure me into signing control over my finances, the coordinated search of my home, and the plan to liquidate property they had no right to touch. Hearing it laid out in order was devastating. It sounded colder, more deliberate than even I had allowed myself to admit. The judge did not hesitate. She declared their actions a clear case of elder abuse carried out with intent and calculation. The sentences followed with quiet finality. Lila received a shorter period of supervised rehabilitation and mandatory community service. Mark faced a harsher penalty along with long-term probation and mandatory counseling. Both were restricted from contacting me unless I chose otherwise. When it was over, I expected relief to wash over me, but instead I felt a slow, heavy unwinding. It did not feel like victory. It felt like the release of a breath I had been holding for far too long. The damage was real, and nothing about the ruling could give me back the trust I had lost. Still, it brought closure, a fragile, necessary closure. Returning home that evening felt different. The house no longer felt polluted by betrayal. It felt like mine again. I set the wooden sign from the Oyster Shack project on a clean table, tracing the grooves made by my husband's hands years ago. The idea of restoring the shack no longer felt like longing. It felt like a beginning. A letter arrived from the court a few days later. A formal apology from Mark and Lila, required as part of their process. I read it once, folded it neatly, and put it away. Forgiveness was no longer something I owed them. Later that week, I walked to the beach at sunset. The sky glowed with soft gold and lavender, and the tide rolled in with the gentle assurance of something eternal. As I watched the waves, it became clear that I was no longer standing in the ruins of my life. I was standing at the edge of something new. Morning arrived gently, as if the world itself wanted to welcome me into a softer chapter. The light over Cape Cod had a golden tint, warm enough to settle into my bones without stirring any old fear. I made a cup of tea and stood near the window, listening to the steady hush of the waves. My home was finally quiet in the way a home should be, absent of shadows and the rustling echoes that once kept me awake. For the first time in a long while, I felt as though the storm had truly passed. I sat at the table with the wooden Oyster Shack sign resting beside me. It had become a symbol of everything I endured and everything I refused to lose. As I traced the worn lettering, memories drifted through me. The first moment suspicion crept in, the painful clarity of betrayal, and the strength it took to fight for my own dignity. I realized that age had never been my weakness. My only vulnerability was believing that love excused harm. Now I knew better. I opened a fresh notebook and wrote down the things I wanted to preserve in my life: self-respect, autonomy, boundaries that no one would be allowed to cross again. I wrote that love must stand beside honor, that care cannot exist without consent, and that older adults have a right to question what feels wrong. The more I wrote, the lighter I felt. These were not merely reflections. They were a promise to myself. As I finished a sentence, the phone rang. A woman from the town of Orleans explained that she managed a community program restoring old family businesses. She had found archived notes about the historic Oyster Shack my husband once dreamed of reopening. She wondered if I might be interested in reviving it with local support. It was not reconciliation with my children, nor a miracle that erased what had happened. It was something better, a step toward a future built entirely by my own hands. I stepped outside, letting the breeze lift the gray strands of my hair. The ocean looked endless, but not intimidating. For the first time in many months, I felt the quiet thrill of possibility. I knew I would rebuild the Oyster Shack. I knew my future no longer depended on anyone who had tried to take it from me. As I headed back inside, I whispered a truth I had earned the hard way. Survival is not the end of the story. It is the beginning of writing a life that finally belongs to you. In the quiet that follows a rupture, there is a moment when a person finally understands that survival is not simply about enduring harm, but about reclaiming the right to one's own story. The closing of one chapter, no matter how turbulent, always carries within it the soft outline of another. Healing asks for patience, clarity, and the courage to choose oneself after years of choosing everyone else. And with that choice comes an unexpected truth. Even the deepest betrayal cannot dim a life that decides to rise again. Renewal does not arrive all at once. It arrives in steady breaths, in restored boundaries, in the calm confidence that the future can be shaped with steady hands and an unbroken spirit. Thank you for spending your time with this story. If it moved you, feel free to share your thoughts below, follow the channel, and subscribe for more stories that resonate deeply.